It is July 1955. Inside a dimly lit post office in Juba, Ruben Yakobo, a southern clerk, sits at his desk, sorting through the day's mail. His fingers paused briefly as they brushed against an envelope stamped with the words, "Top Secret." He has seen these kinds of envelopes before, always for the northern officials, always off limits to southerners like him. He knew the risks. Stealing a classified document could cost him his job, his freedom, and maybe even his life. But the pull of the unknown was too strong. As he scans the envelope carefully, curiosity gets the better of him. He patiently waits for the right moment, his hands trembling as he retrieves the key and opens the drawer. Inside lay the original Arabic version of the telegram. But there's just this one problem. Ruben doesn't read Arabic. Without wasting any more time, he slips the document into his bag and hurries out of the office. He needs someone he could trust, someone who could translate this message. That someone was Fraser Echo, a fellow southerner who works at the provincial headquarters. Fraser was fluent in both English and Arabic, and more importantly, he shared Ruben's growing unease about the North's intention. When Fraser reads the telegram, his face turns pale. The words on the page sent a chill down both men's spines. The telegram, allegedly from Prime Minister Ismail El-Azhari, instructs northern administrators in the south to suppress southerners advocating for federation. Ruben and Fraser know what this means, that the north has no intention of giving southerners a say in their future. So, they take the translated message to a secret political committee led by veteran southern politicians Daniel Jumi and Marco Rume in Juba. But word soon gets out, and soon after, both men are arrested. Despite their arrest and subsequent crackdown in the south, the document is widely circulated across the south, fueling deep resentment. This single telegram would go on to aggravate the north-south tensions, contributing to the outbreak of the first revolt in Sudan. Fast forward to August 18, 1955. Independence is just months away. But in Sudan, the mood is anything but celebratory. In the town of Torit, the Equatorial Corps, a military unit mostly made up of southern Sudanese soldiers trained by the British Colonials, received orders to prepare to travel to Khartoum without their weapons. The soldiers immediately sense a trap, knowing that leaving their weapons behind will put them at the mercy of the northern-controlled army. With their refusal to comply, a northern officer shoots and kills one of the southern soldiers. This sparks a violent rebellion. The southern soldiers retaliate, breaking into the armory, killing their northern officers, and launching a full-scale rebellion, which quickly spreads to other towns in the south. This was only the beginning of the trouble that will plague the country for decades. I want to tell you the story of why we have two Sudans. What really happened between the north and south to cause such a divide? And how did Sudan get to this point? With so much going on right now, I think it becomes increasingly important for more people to come out and express their ideas, thoughts, and opinions without feeling anxious or having any fear of judgment. And I know content creation can seem overwhelming and exhausting, but with in-video AI, you can create content in the most seamless, intuitive way possible, irrespective of whatever skill level you're at. Just type in the idea you want to create a video about and watch as it transforms into a fully structured video.
The US just slapped major tariffs on several countries, causing global economic chaos.
And the best part of that, you can refine it effortlessly using simple text commands. Want to add your voice and start with a joke? Just type it in. This is pretty game-changing. Unlike traditional video tools that come with steep learning curves and only solve bits of the process, in-video AI is your all-in-one creative partner. It removes the friction, puts you in the director's seat, and lets you focus entirely on your vision while it takes care of the heavy lifting. You can try in-video AI for free today. This will save you hundreds of dollars that you would otherwise spend on editing, animating, and other production costs. Click on this link in the description box below to take advantage of this offer while it lasts. Thank you in-video for sponsoring this video. Now, let's get back to the story of South Sudan. The 1955 mutiny that dragged Sudan into chaos was the result of a dividing line that was already drawn years earlier when Britain and Egypt ruled Sudan as a joint colony. It all started in 1899 after Britain defeated the Mahdi state in Sudan. They pressured Egypt's ruler Abbas II to turn Sudan into a shared territory between Egypt and Britain. After much pressure, an agreement was finally reached by both Britain and Egypt to rule Sudan together under what was known as the Anglo-Egyptian Condominium. Under this agreement, Sudan will be run by a governor-general in Khartoum, appointed by Egypt with British consent. While this agreement said both countries would share power, in reality, the British were calling all the shots. However, when Britain moved into southern Sudan in 1902, they immediately noticed resistance from the local communities. So, in 1906, the British introduced the Closed Districts Ordinance, a policy that kept northern Sudanese administrators, merchants, and soldiers out of the south. If a northerner wanted to enter, they needed a special permit from the British. This policy effectively isolated the south from the north, creating a deep divide that would haunt Sudan for decades. Britain saw the south as a problem they didn't want to spend money on. They relied mostly on Egypt's treasury for projects in the north, but had little to spare for the south. Instead of building infrastructure or development projects, they focused on keeping the region under control. And to do this cheaply, British officials turned to local chiefs, believing they could govern indirectly. But this approach failed miserably. British administrators didn't understand local customs or ethnic dynamics, and their policies left the south impoverished and neglected. Added to this, Britain had another concern, which was Egypt itself. They feared that if Egypt and Sudan got too close, a unified Nile Valley could challenge British influence in the region. To avoid all of this, they worked to keep them apart. Abbas II, Egypt's ruler, was not happy about this and tried to push back against British control, but he didn't have much success. Then, World War I broke out in 1914. When the Ottoman Empire, which Egypt was technically a part of, joined the war against Britain, that gave Britain an excuse to remove Abbas II, who was seen as anti-British. They replaced him with his uncle, Hussein Kamal, who was more cooperative with the British and declared Egypt a British colony. This declaration meant Egypt was not fully independent and it was still under British control, even though it was called the Sultanate of Egypt. But this control didn't last long. People were being riled up by Egyptian nationalists who were fed up with British rule. By 1922, their protests and uprisings forced Britain to grant Egypt its independence. However, Sudan was somehow left out of the deal. The British refused to let Sudan join Egypt, even though many Egyptians and Sudanese wanted unity. Instead, Britain kept tightening its grip on Sudan, pushing Egypt out almost completely by 1924 and deepening the divide between North and South Sudan. The North, which was mostly Arab and Muslim, got most of the attention. The British built schools, railways, and other modern infrastructures there. But the South, largely Christian and animist, was left isolated. The British even blocked northern influence, kicking out northern merchants and officials from the South. They also tried to stop the spread of Islam into the South. And for decades, the South was run by British officers known as the Bog Barons, who lived among the locals and did not push for modernization. As a result, the South fell far behind the North in development. Over the next few decades, resentment grew in both Egypt and Sudan over British control of Sudan. By 1951, Egypt's government decided to take a bold step. They declared that Sudan was now part of a united kingdom of Egypt and Sudan, with Egypt's king Farouk as the ruler of both countries. But this move did not last long. Just 8 months later, in 1952, a revolution in Egypt overthrew King Farouk, and the new leaders, Mohamed Naguib and Gamal Abdel Nasser, made Sudanese independence a top priority. Britain, eager to maintain its influence in the Nile Valley and control over the Suez Canal, wanted to remain in the good graces of the new Egyptian government. So, they began negotiating with Egypt over Sudan's future. But while the British and Egyptians hashed out the details, the people of Southern Sudan were again left out of the conversation entirely. In January 1953, northern political parties met in Khartoum to discuss Sudan's future. The Southern Liberal Party, which represented the interests of the South, wasn't even invited. This exclusion set the tone for what was to come. Under pressure from Egypt and growing Sudanese demands, Britain finally agreed to let Sudan become independent. So, in 1953, Egypt and Britain signed an agreement to end the condominium and grant Sudan its freedom. With self-government granted in March 1953, Sudan was finally independent. But for many in the South, nothing had changed. Sudan's independence should have been a moment of celebration, a new dawn for a nation breaking free from colonial rule. Instead, it became the start of a long, painful struggle. Ismail al-Azhari, leader of the National Unionist Party, NUP, took the reins of power as Sudan's first prime minister. But the joy was short-lived. The new government in Khartoum was dominated by northerners. Al-Azhari declared Sudan a unitary state with Arabic as its official language and Islam as its state religion. For the South, this was a major betrayal. It was a sign that their voices, their culture, and their identity would not matter in this new Sudan. Of the 800 government jobs created in 1953, only 4 were given to Southerners. The South demanded a federal system, hoping it would grant them some form of autonomy, but their pleas were ignored. Instead, they were given vague assurances that their concerns would be addressed in a much later date. But patience, you see, has its limit. On August 18, 1955, those limits were reached. Tensions between the North and South erupted in the town of Torit, where Southern soldiers of the Equatorial Corps rebelled against Northern officers, frustrated by years of discrimination and the government's refusal to grant federal status to the South. What started as a mutiny quickly spiraled into violence. The government responded with force, replacing Southern police with Northern officers and cracking down on any signs of dissent. Some mutineers were executed, others fled into the wilderness, disappearing into the dense forest. Civilians, fearing the worst, ran too, some crossing into Uganda and Ethiopia, carrying with them nothing but just the whispers of wars. Back in Khartoum, Al-Azhari's government was already struggling to hold itself together. By July 1956, just 6 months after independence, he was gone, forced out by a vote of no confidence in the Constituent Assembly. Abdallah Khalil of the Umar Party took his place. Sudan's leaders were too busy fighting each other to even notice that the country was gradually slipping into war. The political arena became a battlefield, with different factions vying for control. It was a shaky foundation for a new nation, and it didn't take long for things to begin to fall apart. By 1958, elections were held, and the UP won a decent chunk of seats, but not enough to avoid chaos. Amid this growing instability, the military stepped in. On November 17, 1958, General Lieutenant Ibrahim Aboud led a swift and decisive coup, overthrowing the civilian government. The constitution was immediately suspended, parliament dissolved, political parties banned, and a military government was installed. Just like that, Sudan's brief experiment with democracy was over. Aboud was a military man to the core, and he had a vision: a Sudan unified under Islam and Arab culture. If that could be done peacefully, great, but if not, he was willing to use force. For Southerners, this meant even more alienation. Their chiefs, who had once held some local power, were stripped of authority, and they were given a choice: embrace Islam or lose everything. Some chiefs, desperate to hold on to their status, gave in. They were paraded around Khartoum like trophies, flown in on government planes, their names broadcast over Radio Omdurman. It was a show, a spectacle designed to convince the South that their resistance was futile. But the people weren't fooled. Instead of converting, they fled. Thousands left their homes, crossing borders into exile rather than bow to forced Islamization. Arabic was now the only language allowed in government offices. This single decision locked Southerners out of government jobs, the army, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The South saw it for what it was, a way to keep them powerless. Even northern merchants in the South were told to carry Qurans everywhere they went, reinforcing the idea that Islam was sweeping through the land. The education system was not left out. By 1960, students had to learn Arabic and study Islam if they wanted an education. The final insult came in February 1960, when Friday was declared the official day of rest, replacing Sunday. For Southern Christians, this was war. The resistance started small. At Rumbek Secondary School, students had had enough. They wrote to Abode himself, demanding respect for their rights. Copies of the letter were sent to the Minister of Education, the Governor, and the Headmaster. The response was swift and brutal. Students were beaten, some thrown in jail. Northern Sudanese merchants were said to have led the security forces into the parade of students and handpicked those whom they thought were ringleaders. These northern merchants were not in the South for trade alone. They served as the eyes and ears of Aboud's government in the South. In the midst of all this chaos, the students received a letter from the Southern Sudanese politicians in exile, informing them of a strong rebel force that stood ready to take back Juba and liberate the South from the North. Soon enough, the school was shut down. Many of the students fled into exile, but they weren't running away. They were preparing for war. The rebellion that had begun in Torit never truly died. The survivors regrouped. Hardened by exile, they turned their rebellion into something bigger. They called themselves Anya-Nya, meaning snake venom in the Madi language. And now, they were ready to strike. By 1964, the situation in Sudan had escalated. Protests erupted across the country. Students, workers, and ethnic Nubians took to the streets, demanding change. The government responded with force. In Omdurman, 12 protesters were shot dead. In Khartoum, 36 more. The death toll climbed, and Sudan was soon on the verge of collapse. Abode, unable to control the chaos, dissolved his own government. A transitional government led by Sakatim Khalifa took over on the 30th of October 1964, and Abode resigned 2 weeks later. By the time calm slowly returned, over 100 people had died in the chaos. From 1964 to 1969, Sudan limped forward trying to rebuild. Elections were held in 1965, and the Umar party again emerged victorious with Umar al-Azari as president and Mohamed Ahmed Magoub as prime minister. However, political battles, coups, and violence continued. Back in the south, the Anya-Nya rebels had grown stronger, fueled by southern anger of marginalization. The Sudanese government, led by Prime Minister al-Azari and Magoub, responded with brutal force yet again. They launched a policy of collectivization, rounding up southern civilians and forcing them into so-called peace villages along major roads and towns. The idea was simple: to isolate the Anya-Nya rebels from the population, cutting off their supply lines and support. But the reality was far darker. These peace villages were anything but peaceful. They were overcrowded, unsanitary, and lacked basic necessities like food and clean water. Soon enough, this place was plagued with diseases, and hundreds of people died from cholera and other illnesses. For many Southerners, the choice was grim: stay in the villages and suffer, or flee back to the bush and risk being hunted down by government forces. The government's tactics were ruthless. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and civilians massacred. The goal was to crush the southern resistance at any cost. But the Anya-Nya rebels were resilient. They fought a guerrilla war, striking quickly and then disappearing into the dense forests and mountains of the south. Despite being outgunned and outnumbered, they managed to keep the fight alive for years. Then on May 25, 1969, another military officer made his move. Colonial Ghaffar Mohammed al-Nimri decided it was his turn. Staging Sudan's second military coup, he overthrew the government, banned political parties again, and set up a revolutionary command council. On that day, he also promoted himself to Major General, retired 22 serving officers, mostly senior to himself. He dismissed over 30 and appointed 14 new officers to the most important posts. He later became prime minister on the 26th of October 1969. One of the bloodiest chapters of his rule came in 1970 when he clashed with the Ansar sect, a powerful religious group. The government of Sudan, backed by Egyptian and Libyan forces, brutally suppressed this rebellion. About 20,000 people were killed, including the sect's leader, Imam al-Hadi al-Mahdi, who were associated with the Ummah party that opposed him. Nimeri's regime was ruthless, executing political opponents and cracking down on dissent. But Nimeri's grip on power wasn't absolute. In 1971, he was briefly overthrown in a coup led by Major Hashim al-Atta, only to regain control days later with the help of Egypt and Libya. The cycle of violence continued. By the early 1970s, both sides were exhausted. The war had dragged on for nearly 2 decades, and neither the government nor the rebels could claim victory. In 1972, with the help of Ethiopia's emperor Haile Selassie, the two sides finally reached an agreement in Addis Ababa. The Addis Ababa agreement granted the South a degree of self-rule, created a regional government, and gave Southerners more representation in the national government. This ended the first Sudanese civil war. The Sudanese people were relieved. They got 11 years of peace. For a brief moment, things looked bright, and then it was chaos all over again. To many in the north, the concessions granted to the south felt like a betrayal. After decades of dominance, the idea of sharing power, let alone autonomy, was a bitter pill to swallow. President Jafar Nimeri, the man who had proposed to bring Sudan together, believed he had achieved a lasting solution. But in reality, he had merely set the stage for an even greater storm. By 1981, under pressure from Islamic opponents, Nimeri made a dramatic shift towards Islamic political governance and allied himself with the Muslim Brotherhood in an attempt to solidify his power. This move sent shockwaves through the entire country. The South saw it as yet another form of northern oppression. The fear that the autonomy that was just given to them was about to be taken away. And then it happened. In 1983, Nimeri indeed abolished the South's autonomy and imposed Sharia law across the entire country, creating resentment and fear among the country's large non-Muslim population. He even attempted to have himself declared Imam of the Sudanese Ummah, but somehow failed. To show his dedication to Sharia, he poured $11 million worth of alcohol into the Nile. This betrayal reignited the conflict yet again, leading to the Second Sudanese Civil War, a war that would be even bloodier and more devastating than the first. While President Jafar Nimeri was thousands of miles away in the United States, pleading for financial aid, the ground beneath his rule was shifting. Back home in Sudan, the people had had enough. In a swift and bloodless move, Nimeri's own defense minister, General Abdelrahman Swar al-Dahab, seized power. Just like a flash, Nimeri's rule was over. Swar al-Dahab positioned himself as a temporary leader, promising democracy. True to his word, in May 1986, he handed power over to an elected government led by Ahmed al-Meghani as head of state and Sadiq al-Mahdi as prime minister. Sadiq al-Mahdi had been given a second chance at power, but history was not on his side. He had been overthrown once before in 1969, and now he faced an even more difficult battle. His government was weak and fractured. Corruption spread like wildfire, and the country remained deeply divided, with the biggest challenge being the ongoing civil war. As the war raged on, rebel groups, once scattered and disorganized, found a common cause and regrouped. The Sudan People's Liberation Army emerged, led by John Garang, a man who understood both the North and the South and knew exactly how to rally his people. They didn't just want independence for the South. They wanted Sudan to be a multiracial, multi-religious, and multi-ethnic nation where all people had a voice. As peace negotiations began, tensions within Sadiq's government worsened. His coalition was split. Some wanted a ceasefire, an end to Islamic law, and the lifting of the state of emergency. But there were factions, particularly the National Islamic Front, which refused every form of compromise. When the Democratic Unionist Party pulled out of the coalition, the military generals grew restless. They wanted stability, they wanted results. But when Sadiq failed to implement a ceasefire, they decided they would take matters into their own hands. The North, heavily armed and determined to maintain control, unleashed a wave of destruction. The fighting was brutal. Villages were burned, families torn apart, and entire communities uprooted. In the South, despite being outgunned, they fought back with guerrilla warfare, using the dense jungles and vast swamps to their advantage. This wasn't just a battle over land anymore. It was a fight for survival, and left to bear the brunt were the civilians. Hunger and disease swept through the war zones. What had begun as a political struggle quickly turned into a humanitarian catastrophe. Children were forced to become soldiers. Entire generations grew up knowing nothing but war. Years passed, and the conflict only deepened. International powers took notice, but their involvement was often driven by their own interests rather than a genuine desire for peace. Meanwhile, Sudanese leaders played a dangerous game, using alliances and betrayals to maintain their grip on power. Peace talks would come and go, but the bloodshed never truly stopped. Then came 1989, when another coup changed everything. On this fateful day in June 1989, Lieutenant General Omar Hussein Ahmad Al-Bashir staged a coup removing Sadiq's fragile government. Unlike Swar al-Dahab, Bashir had no intention of stepping aside. He would go on to rule Sudan for the next 30 years. Bashir's rule would become one of the most oppressive in Sudan's history. But he wasn't acting alone. By his side was Hassan al-Turabi, a radical Islamist and leader of the National Islamic Front. Together, they sought to reshape Sudan in their vision, imposing Islamic law, that is, the Sharia, in the north. This move only deepened the wounds between the predominantly Muslim north and the Christian and animist south. When al-Bashir took power, the Second Sudanese Civil War had been ongoing for 9 years. The civil war soon effectively developed into a conflict between the Sudan People's Liberation Army and al-Bashir's government. This war resulted in millions of Southerners being displaced, starved, and deprived of education and healthcare, with almost 2 million casualties. In 1993, Bashir solidified his power, declaring himself Sudan's president. He held on to power through rigged elections and ruthless suppression of the opposition. But then, in a dramatic twist, he turned on his closest ally. In 1998, al-Turabi, once his right-hand man, was suddenly the enemy. Bashir accused him of plotting a coup and had him removed. With his former mentor gone, Bashir now ruled unchecked, raining terror on his own people. But the worst was yet to come. In 2003, the world watched in horror as Sudan descended into yet another humanitarian crisis, but this time in the western region of Darfur. Rebel groups in the western region, fed up with years of neglect and oppression, rose up against Bashir's government. As usual, he responded with brutal force, but not with the country's military. He unleashed the Janjaweed, a ruthless Arab militia, to crush this rebellion. But their methods went beyond combat. They burned entire villages to the ground. Women were raped, men and children were slaughtered. The scale of brutality was unimaginable. More than 300,000 people were killed. Over 2 million people were driven from their homes. To make matters worse, Bashir's own government blocked international aid, ensuring that starvation and disease finished the job. The world condemned these atrocities, but Bashir couldn't care less. In 2009, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for him, charging him with war crimes and crimes against humanity. But Bashir, in his usual manner, laughed it off, continuing to rule with an iron fist. Meanwhile, another conflict was inching toward a resolution. For decades, Sudan's North-South war had raged on, fueled by religious and ethnic differences. But in 2005, something remarkable happened. The warring sides signed the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, granting the South a choice to either stay part of Sudan or break away and form a new country. The vote was set for January 2011, and when the time came, the decision was overwhelming. More than 98% of South Sudanese voted for independence. They had fought too hard, suffered too much to remain under Sudan's rule. And on July 9, 2011, history was made.
Has marked the end of an era, and today is the beginning of a new era in our history.
On this fateful day, under the scorching Juba sun, tens of thousands gathered to witness the birth of a new nation. Flags waved, drums pounded, and voices rose in celebration. Salva Kiir, South Sudan's new president, stood before the crowd alongside leaders from around the world. When Sudan's flag was finally lowered and South Sudan's flag took its place, the people erupted in cheers. Their dreams of freedom finally realized. But as it is with all African countries, there is always foreign interference whenever there is conflict and a push for democracy. Yeah, US aid was involved. The agency provided what they called a comprehensive assistance for the January 2011 referendum on self-determination for Southern Sudan. Prior to the 2011 referendum, USAID also claimed to have supported peace processes, humanitarian assistance, and development programs in this region. Some of the agency's efforts included promoting democratic governance, providing health and education services, and facilitating economic recovery. This last one is laughable because, ironically, the economies of both Sudans collapsed shortly thereafter. However, these initiatives provided by USAID were, quote, aimed to create a conducive environment for the peaceful secession of South Sudan from Sudan. Well, the reality is now far from what everyone imagined will happen. Independence has so far not translated to peace for either of the Sudans. While both South and North Sudan now have their own separate countries, they were soon each faced with a new crisis, resulting in new civil wars being fought over power and control. So, my question is, was it worth it? That will be a story for another day.